Hi there, and welcome to the You, Me, We Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Jackie, and this is a podcast about emotions. And the reason why is because I'm a counsellor. I deal with emotions on a regular basis as part of my job, and I'm fascinated by them. They have a very physical effect on our body. They can make one feel sick. They can make one feel exhilarated. They can give you stomach pains to butterflies, Emotions play a huge part in our life, and acknowledging emotions can have the potential to shift you along onto different paradigms. It takes personal growth, it takes determination, and I think at the end of the day, we're all spiritual babies and we're here trying to make our way through this thing called life. So it can be complicated. Emotions can trip us up. Sometimes we can be in a habit of neglecting them. But in this podcast, I'd like to bring about some things that I think are important to acknowledge with regards to emotions, because emotions affect mental health and mental well-being, which ultimately this podcast is going to be about. So sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy the show. Some of the topics I may talk about could be triggering, and I would like you to take responsibility for your own personal care in that matter. If you feel you've been deeply moved by anything that's come up and you think it deserves deeper exploration, please go and seek a professional mental health practitioner that will be able to help you manage these feelings. If you're in a crisis situation and you feel you are unable to keep yourself safe, please take yourself to accident and emergency. If you heard me just mention, I'm talking about things that I feel are foundational to get a grasp on. You'll know, you'll understand. What do you think of this? What did you just say to me? Yeah. Have you ever heard yourself say something like that or thinking something like that? Yeah, that's right. I'm talking about being triggered. Triggers. What are they? And why did I need to give a warning sign for those who are listening about possibly being triggered? Let's take it from a stance of being a place of being unaware. A boundary has been threatened. There's a feeling of being offended. When you delve deeper into the feeling of being offended, you may find that it could be connected to the ego. Now, the ego comes in different parts. If you consider it from a Freudian perspective, a psychoanalytical perspective, there are many different theories about it that are not psychoanalytical, but let's stick to psychoanalytical for the purpose of this example. I like the perspective, actually. I remember when I was training, I found it interesting and it helped me understand it in this way that I'm going to explain to you now. For example, the Freudian perspective has the ego in three parts. You have the id, the ego, and the superego. I liked that way of understanding it. It gave me a visual picture in my mind. For example, the id. If you think of a child who has a ball standing on the side of the road, the ball, they're bouncing it, and it bounces off into the road, the child will have the urge to want to chase after that ball because that child has urges. The urge to bounce the ball, and then the ball bounces off, the urge to run after it. The child has urges. Those urges come from a place of that infantile part of our ego, the id. The ego would be considered the part of us as an individual. Let's say, think back to that child, ball bounced off the road. The ego part would be the part that would stay on the curb, look left, look right before stepping off into the road. they would think about it, the level of consideration about crossing that road before getting the ball. There's an awareness about it. Then the superego, the superego is like a parental side. This is where it gets complicated. Perhaps you had parents that were berating you, the ball bouncing off into the road, that the ego part looks left or right, but the superego comes in and berates you and says something like, oh, you stupid child, you let the ball just bounce off into the road, you didn't look what you were doing, you were not considerate of what you were doing. That kind of criticism, you know, that could be a narrative that could play in somebody's head, and it comes from a place of a superego, quite critical. There might be a version that's maybe less critical than that, like oh, the ball bounced off, you know, don't do that next time, do better next time. You know, something along those lines like that. It's an overarching part of the ego, the superego. So that overarching part of the ego comes from a very infantile, parental relationship part of us. And that structure can form our ego, from a Freudian perspective, that is. Triggers can catch us at a particular place in that ego. Depending on what the trigger is, you may find good reason to be triggered. Or it could be that there's an imbalance in the ego and actually you're triggered often. There's a touchy, sensitive part of your ego. So I wanted to bring in that kind of formation in that sense, to link it to that formulation of the ego and what it could be to be offended. Really, I suppose what it could be looked at as well with triggers is that there could be a fear that one's perspective isn't being taken into account, and thinking, am I safe? Something's just happened, and am I safe in this situation right now? It could have a trauma response, because now there is a threat, and with a trauma response comes with, you've heard of this, I'm sure, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. For those who don't know what that is, I'll give an example. Feeling triggered could be a response like, what did you just say to me when I said that earlier? That could be quite defensive and seem quite confrontational, right? It has the vibe that a fight could kick off. That could be the fight response. A flight response from somebody getting triggered could be somebody thinking, oh, I need to get out of here, and just duck out of the back door, leave the conversation. Yeah, have a think of, use your imagination to think about somebody wanting to flight from a situation. Somebody could be triggered from a situation now and could feel freeze, feel put on the spot, not know what to say, feel bumbling and fumbling with words, their mind may be racing and they're frozen and they can't really regulate themselves in a decent way to put any action to what they've got going on, and they're stuck, they're frozen. And a fawn response might be somebody where someone's trying to appease the threat, be people pleasing, and if you're liked enough, then the threat won't want to hurt you. So yes, that kind of, in a fawn way, might look like people pleasing. Perhaps even trying to use humour to bounce off the pain, in hoping that the pain won't continue to hurt. A deflective way, probably. That's me describing a little bit about what a trigger could be from an unaware perspective, let's say. Triggers can also be something that we can be fully aware of. We may know what triggers us, and it could be from a knowing place, an awareness of a sensitive area in oneself, knowing that there's an area where there's a history behind something said or done or witnessed, and you know that that place has quite a delicate side to it, and there can be a sudden quick jump back to a time of difficulty that one hasn't fully processed or come to a full satisfying conclusion about as to what's really taken place. And that trigger might be something that could be expressed openly, or might be something that's kept quite privately. Triggers, they may be things that I discuss in this podcast, and in life in general. Life brings about triggers. Before you know it, you might find you're in an argument with somebody, or something's caused you to freeze. Something's brought a sick feeling to your stomach. And when there's a trigger warning about something, that's the opportunity to be aware, to be forewarned, rather than it come as a surprise. Having an awareness about these things brings about the opportunity to grow, to learn, and to be able to do something about it, because a lot of emotions come from being triggered, and it's really important to differentiate between the two things. For example, the difference between being triggered and provoked potentially could look quite similar in a very subtle form, but there's a difference. I'd say the thing that can make it different is the intention behind it. So if someone's triggered by something I'm saying in this podcast, and they may think personally to me, I'm just using this as an example, you may be triggered by somebody in the shop and you take it personally between you and that person. What I'm trying to give here is an example. The intention behind it, somebody's intention behind it is when they're provoking you, is that there's a level of awareness of what they're doing. And for somebody who's triggered or triggers another person, there may be likely that there's a level of unawareness about what they're doing, that they don't know that you have a fear of a particular thing. So I think it's important to know the difference between the two. And triggers are broad. I've just discussed it on a level that I think is relevant to the context of this particular podcast and my trigger warning at the beginning, in my introduction. But triggers can lead on to other areas in mental health. Other things to consider about triggers, for example, in the world of neurodiversity, triggers are things that people on these spectrums live with on a daily basis, on a regular basis. There's sensory triggers, there could be sensory overload, and these called triggers. Lights can be too bright, sounds can be too loud, certain clothing can feel uncomfortable, thoughts can trigger other thoughts and behaviours as well. For example, somebody with ADHD or autism, people who fall into categories such as that can be affected by triggers. For example, someone with be understimulated, it could trigger to boredom, which can then trigger other behaviours to kind of seek some sort of form of kind of entertainment, which has to do with like dopamine levels, for example, which is a chemical in the brain. It gets a little bit more technical. So triggers operate on a neurological level. I'm just trying to keep it on a conversational level here, but I'm just using that as an example. So things can trigger some things that go on to other behaviours. So it's something to bear in mind when it comes to triggers. Can you think of a time where something occurred and actually you were surprised that you were not triggered by that thing, because there was a time where it would have triggered you? Something didn't trouble you in the same way that it once did. Think about how that could show up in your life. And maybe now I've mentioned it, something to be looking out for. So when something like that happens, something that doesn't bother you, that once did bother you, it's an opportunity to notice that there's perhaps growth. Something has shifted in you. What has shifted in you? Alternatively, bear in mind, be aware that it could indicate that you've now developed a level of tolerance for something that you did not have a tolerance for once before. And are you tolerating something that's healthy or something that's unhealthy? Because something can go from being really difficult to deal with to over time, like a slow drip, becoming normal. So normal doesn't always mean healthy or right. I'll give an example like this. You could be sleeping with a blanket on and it falls off in the night, let's say, and you start to feel a bit cold, but you're too tired to reach for it and pull it back on. So you tolerate sleeping being a little bit chilly, and before you know it, you slept that way and you woke up that way and not had a particularly comfortable night, but you tolerated it. So you see what I'm saying with regards to something can be normal, but normal doesn't mean right. It might be normal that a blanket falls off. I mean, that's gravity, right? But your level of tolerance has covered you, that you've not bothered to reach for it, and the situation, you've not put yourself in the best position. So when something, like an alternative to what I've just said there, something could have been bothering you at one point and it's not bothering you now, be aware that, is it serving you in the best interest, that it's not bothering you anymore. Equally, there may be things that suddenly starts troubling you that you never had an awareness that it was an issue before. When that happens, it might be worth noting, are you quite anxious at that particular time? Have things happened that have caused you a lot of anxiety? When anxiety builds up after a period of time, you may find that regular day-to-day things has you quite jumpy. You might be walking down the street minding your own business and a cyclist cycles past you, and the whoosh of them cycling behind you causes you to jump. It's quite a normal thing for a cyclist to cycle, but that thing causes you to jump, has you on edge. Regular things that wouldn't have troubled you once before now start to trouble you. And what triggers are connected to are anxiety. Anxiety can be linked to a sense of a lack of control, a sense of having things out of your control, changes and shock that leave you feeling you're in a disadvantaged position. Empowerment can be the solution to being triggered, these feelings of things being out of your control. Empowerment, I'd say, starts at awareness. Isn't it funny though, what triggers you though? I remember when Netflix some years back was just Netflix, regular Netflix. They would have their thumbnails lined up as usual. Then it changed where you would hover your cursor, the selecting tool, over the thumbnail, and the thumbnail would instantly come to life. We would animate into a preview of that movie or that episode. It's like that now, but it never used to be. When that first happened, I have to be honest, that was something I couldn't tolerate. I actually cancelled my Netflix prescription because of it. I couldn't bear it. It suddenly had this movement. The sound was overbearing. Cinema level, Dolby surround sound, loud, sudden movements. It was just too much. I used to find it triggering. It's just interesting. I'm using that as an example. It's interesting what can be a problem for some people and not a problem at all for other people. Triggers can surprise us. What can be problematic is when triggers interfere with progressing, when they become a sticking point and hard to move on from. When it affects somebody's functionality in their life. In some circumstances with triggers, somebody could be a victim of a crime, something could have happened, for example, and it could lead to along the lines of post-traumatic stress or complex post-traumatic stress. These things can come from abusive relationships, or a prolonged period of stress can lead to complex post-traumatic stress. And there's good reasons for the triggers, because it's brought about hypervigilancy, and at a point in that particular person's life, being quick and sharp to the threat became a survival tool. However, it may have led on to now manifesting itself in their day-to-day life, where it becomes a hindrance. So at one point it served a level of a purpose, yet at a certain point it can be debilitating. Triggers can be an indicator that something needs to be addressed. And what can be addressed is that triggers are things that need soothing and healing and compassion and empathy, and the ability for one to empathize with themselves about their triggers. Yeah, I hope you found what I've shared today helpful. So, this is my extended version of a trigger warning, and that's why I put that at the front of my introduction about triggers. And I hope you've learned a little bit more about triggers now, because I want to build on this podcast. So if you're starting from the beginning with me, I want to explain my approach throughout the first episodes of this podcast before I really start moving into the meat of what I want to discuss. I want you to know the foundations of where I'm coming from. Yeah, come back for more. Have a lovely day.